is we have a fairly tight schedule, as you might have seen from the programs. We have 8 presenters. And so just 15 minutes per panel, and I'm going to keep my remarks very, very brief so that we have enough time to hear from our students, because that's why we're all here today. So let me just start by introducing myself. I'm Professor Bernstein, Professor Elizabeth Bernstein, and I'm here in my capacity as the leader of the second semester of the senior seminar for WGSS at Barnard. And it's a really special time of year, I'm thrilled. This is best time, I think, for me and for most of the students to celebrate the culmination of all the work that they've been doing all year. It feels like today in particular, many, many seasons, so hot today. But you're going to see that our students, our majors, draw on a variety of different approaches to their work, methodologically and theoretically. All of your projects, in my opinion, really demonstrate a commitment to high quality, innovative, and theoretically engaged research. And so very, very proud of our students, and let's just start by giving them a big hand. Okay, now to say a little bit more about the process that they've undertaken. They've completed 2 semesters of a senior thesis workshop, and whether they're analyzing Reddit data or interviewing the editor of Teen Vogue, they've been producing multiple drafts of their work, culminating in their final thesis projects, which are anywhere from 30 to 80 pages. And in the past, many of our students have actually published their work, and I think I wouldn't be surprised if that happens again. So just a few acknowledgements before we get started. I'd like to start by congratulating the students for their work, both the students who are in the thesis class and those there are other seniors here who I know have produced a variety of other capstone projects, and I think they should also be celebrated for their work. So we can give them. And I'd like to also thank their support systems, both those who support systems who are in attendance and those who couldn't make it today, right? So family, friends, chosen family, chosen friends. Hello, there's more. Okay, yeah. Hello? And in particular, they're very, very dedicated outside readers, so a round of applause. I would especially like to acknowledge Dana Jacobson, chair of the WGSS Department of Barnard. Really wanted to be here today, but couldn't, and she sends her warmest congratulations to all of the students, and is really excited for all of you. So very, very important there. And she was actually the person who taught the first semester of the senior thesis class this year and launched all of these exciting projects that you're about to hear. Okay. I also want to thank all the WGSS and Earweb faculty from both sides of the street. So they've been preparing these students for years. Thanks to them. Final words. I just want to say, in my humble opinion, I think all of these projects are really worthy of honors, and I mean that, actually. So know that. But I want to acknowledge just two papers in particular that were awarded special recognition by the Barnard WGSS program this year. Talia Comran, who received the Bessie Ehrlich Prize for Excellence in Research. You look shocked. It happens without submission.
Okay.
It's an anonymous process. Our first paper, by the way, is on shocking currencies. So. Okay, and then also Emma May, who received the Jane Gould Prize. Which honors student work that furthers our understanding of a contemporary social or political issue. Okay. All right, so with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to Professor Chilakowski, who's going to say a few words, and then I'll just come back for 1 minute to talk about how the presentations are going to go.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi everyone, welcome. I'm Laura Chilakowski. I'm Associate Director of the Institute for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality. Welcome everyone. It's so nice to see this packed room with family and friends and all of these great thesis writers. So I'm going to be very brief. I have the great pleasure and fun job of awarding our 3 Earwags undergraduate essay prizes. So I'm just going to do that now. Our 11th annual Women and Gender Studies Award, which honors an undergraduate for excellence in research and writing in the field of women's and gender studies, goes to Edward Krause. Is Edward here? Hi, you want to come up? We have a really nice certificate for you. Congratulations. Congratulations. And now this year is, we are awarding our inaugural Feminist to the Core Essay Prize, and this is awarded annually. It's our first prize to the undergraduate who has written, judged to have written the best essay on any topic in feminist or queer studies in either literature humanities, contemporary civilization, art humanities, or music humanities. And our inaugural winner is Clara Beccaro for her fantastic essay, Madam and Steve, Queer Theory in Paradise Lost. The 23rd Annual Queer Studies Award, 23 years, that's really amazing. It's established in 1994 and it honors an undergraduate for excellence in research and writing in the rapidly growing field of queer studies. This goes to Sadie Yudkin, who is not here today, but her essay was titled "The Future is Queer, It's Here, Contemporary New York City Music Scenes and Queer Theory in Practice or Praxis." So thank you, and I hope we all enjoy the presentations.
Okay, so just a few words about how this is going to go. So you can see from your programs that we've there's 3 panels, right? The first panel is on affect and aesthetics, and so we're going to have all 3 presenters speak first, and then the group will come up to the front and take questions together, and then we'll move on to the second panel. Okay, so with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Izzy Ivins, who's going to be presenting on shocking currency.
Hi, my name is Izzy Ivins, and my senior thesis project is titled Shocking Currencies, Cybernetic Sociality, and the Affect of Economy of Shock. Alright, so first, before I begin analysis, I'm going to give some background on why I chose to pursue this topic. Some primary concerns that govern this paper, but also major themes that I pursue in other work, are the following topics. The web as a site of social performance and political cohesion, the circulation of emotion as a political strategy and effect, drawing from Sara Ahmed, a scholar who I touch upon later more in depth. And finally, the ideological relationships between new media technology and colonialism. So as I began doing primary research online, looking at kind of discourse surrounding the election, there were 2 major narratives that I saw coming to the forefront. The first is that this was the internet election, and the second was that Trump's victory represents a failed faith in the future. So, number 1, the internet election. This kind of came from a consensus that Trump is a post-ideological candidate, or was a post-ideological candidate, insofar as he escapes traditional left and right boundaries of the industrial, kind of traditional left-right categories. And that this is achievable only in the internet age, when our politics and our society have become disaggregated and traditional agendas have been shattered. It is this notion of the internet as existing within and generative of a muddied ideological framework that I wish to interrogate. In particular, what such a claim means in relation to the similar argument of a political event of 2016 as somehow embodying internet culture in its scattered, fragmented, often nonsensical political discourse. And how does the simultaneity of 2 conflicting assertions of the internet as libertarian cybercommon and of its causal implication in the election of a neo-fascist with open ties to white supremacy shed light upon the ideological background that made Trump's election possible? That was really dry. The second narrative that I saw coming to the forefront was that Trump's victory for many liberals signaled a failed faith in the future. For those of us who had seen Barack Obama's 2008 election as a verification of racial progress, and who had imagined Clinton's victory as a continuation of the nation's flourishing trend line towards social democracy, November 8, 2016 marked a crisis of faith, in which Americans' unshakable belief in history's upward trajectory, our shared religion, had failed. For many voters who were opposed to Trump, the shock of his victory was bound up with the shock of learning that one's vision of the future might not be as unanimous as previously thought. And when I was reading this, when I was pulling out this thread, questions that came to my mind were precisely whose future is now confined by Trump. Where did this master narrative of broad social improvement, of society careening readily upward, come from? And by its dominance within national imaginarian discourse, who does this narrative necessarily exclude in order to make itself legible? Put another way, how can we refuse this structural negation and account for those whose livelihoods were already in jeopardy, whose future was already canceled? So now I'm going to turn to some of my analytic methods and critical approaches. Just take a moment to look at the emojis. So for my primary field data or field research, I conducted close reading and critical analysis of digitally mediated discourse from sites across the political spectrum, from comments on New York Times articles to threads on Reddit, which for those of you who don't know is kind of a social network that relies on kind of comment threads that are the top one, the ones that are put to the top are the ones that have the most clicks or the most upvotes, so it's very much like a kind of, it's managed by the users. And so that was kind of where I got my field work, my research, which was unsatisfying to say the least. And kind of for my theoretical background, I drew heavily from the work of Sara Ahmed, who's one of my primary interlocutors. In particular, I focus on her 2004 essay, Affective Economies, in which her theorization of affect or emotion is one that emphasizes the circulation of emotion as a way of producing normative ways of being and relating to one another. In other words, emotions stick people together through the circulation of signs. I'm angry, you see I'm angry, you get angry, we're angry together. And I mean, it's more complicated than that. And so in my project, I'm updating Ahmed to look at one very specific affective economy within cybernetic sociality. So what is cybernetic sociality? I now want to address my decision behind my usage of the term cybernetic sociality rather than digital sociality or internet social life or something like that. So cybernetics is a transdisciplinary approach to studying communication and control that analyzes a regulatory system that incorporates a closed signaling loop. So that's a lot of words. A closed signaling loop is one that all the parts within the system necessarily rely on one another in order to make kind of the function coherent. So you take a part out, like it ceases to function. And so necessarily one part or one node relies upon the existence of the other nodes within the closed circuit. And I saw this as very much in conversation with Sara Ahmed's work on the circulation of emotion, kind of a connection that I wanted to pull out more and see how it operated within the currency of shock. So in short, cybernetic sociality is digitally mediated forms of social cohesion that work through circulation within the social field of the internet. And this leads me to my next kind of primary term that I deploy throughout the work, which is the shock economy. So drawing from Ahmed and drawing from kind of cybernetics as a field, rather than arguing that discourse that occurs in liberal spaces online exists in a vacuum or an echo chamber, separate from that of the alt-right and neoconservatives who took to the web kind of pre and post-Trump, I am arguing the case for a single affective economy of shock, one that cannot exist without kind of the various poles or the various, in other words, liberal shock cannot exist outside of its relationship with conservative shock. So it's a currency that I track within the closed circuit of this online discourse. And so within a closed loop system of online political discourse, I move from analyzing the ways that shock works to bind different figures and different groups together. I would be remiss to say if I didn't say that my project is fundamentally an effort of feminist critique insofar as gender is a central analytic deployed by both the voice of reason liberal media and the alt-right in order to further claims of political legibility. Whether it's the New York Times reporting on and extrapolating from white women's shock post-Trump, or misogynistic cyber trolls heralding white patrimony, gender was drastically useful in maintaining and extending social cohesion during the election cycle. And so the Kill All Normies book, which is the best book to bring out in a library and just like crack open, is a key interlocutor that I use throughout my research. So the book Kill All Normies casts a wide survey of digital cultures surrounding the election, especially in, Nagel, not Ahmed. Nagel mostly focuses on kind of alt-right discourse and like the trolls that were operating online during the election. And for Nagel, what binds the bigger name conservative voices with, this is her quote, a host of Pepe meme-making gamers and 4chan style shitposters who had little in the way of a coherent commitment to conservative thought or politics, was in fact a shared anti-PC impulse and a common aesthetic sensibility. In this sense, the alt-right was not necessarily generated, but in fact amalgamated through deploying shock or transgression in order to kind of maintain a political coherence that wasn't necessarily there. And it was a collective response to the expanding identity politics of more feminine spaces like Tumblr. And these, which is kind of, I have that image, so I signal that. In these identity politics spaces, gender, particularly womanhood, took on a monolithic presence. Many women, especially white women who voted for Hillary, expressed that female Trump voters were betraying the female sex because of Trump and his cabinet's conservative positions on abortion and reproductive health. But conjuring women as a monolithic category, who should vote a certain way, colors over the other structures of power and privilege that create the material conditions of women's lives. So I was interested in exploring gender in kind of both of these sites and across these sites as well. After doing more and more research, I narrowed down to two main field sites that I wanted to research more and that I wanted to really perform close readings on. The first is Reddit comments and comments on New York Times articles surrounding right after the election, 2 a.m. on November 9th. And the second is kind of discourse surrounding the implementation of Executive Order 13769, which is commonly understood or known as the Muslim ban. Because I saw these sites as particularly shocking and particularly iterative of some of the themes that I explored later in the paper, especially in regards to the colonial dimensions of new media and the underpinning nationalist discourse that grounds both liberal and conservative views around the election. Oh, shit. Sorry, my bad. So this is a comment, this one right here, on the r/politics subreddit, which is kind of one of the more centrist subreddits. And so I tried to look at the_Donald subreddit for kind of that angle, and this was my centrist site. So I'm gonna kind of pull apart a little bit of this comment and show you what some of the things that I'm looking at, how they're working. So this comment from user Orky56 states, "Remember the days when the worst things were the Patriot Act, TSA, and waterboarding? Hate to say those were the good old days. And the worst thing is, I don't even know what we were reacting to. Crime, unemployment, terror attacks, etc. are all at their lowest. Is it just the fact that Obama was black, Hillary was weak, and Russia took advantage? Sad times indeed." And so this blend of despair and surprise that around the Muslim ban is kind of transmuted into this half-hearted nostalgia that where this user is saying that, remember the days when the worst things were only waterboarding? Which is, I mean, yeah. And so what I kind of, when I was playing part in this, is that shock around this, or shock as despair, shock as kind of it's very much at a loss, this comment, for me, like the sad times indeed. What this does is it instigates a reorientation to the past. And for ERP 56, this new orientation is scarcely hopeful. The resigned tone of the comment, insofar as it signals reluctant acceptance of what we have become. And something that, when I was reading this comment, really stuck out to me is in the second line in the middle. And the worst thing is, I don't even know what we are reacting to. And so that we, it cleaves him, even kind of the hesitant citizen, even though he doesn't really agree with what Trump is doing, he still kind of implicates himself in this, insofar as he's part of the we. So there's this underlying notion that the nation has to kind of back up or stand behind the president, not no matter what he does, but there's like the rueful acceptance can only go so far. And so this rhetorical bind, or what Sarah Ahmed might call a metonymic slide, flags the resignation that ERP 56 expresses at the end of the comment, sad times indeed, as acceptance of Trump's executive order, and implicates the passive commenter in a discursive national collective. So again, two of the things I saw going on here were shock as kind of instigating a reorientation to the past and coloring over past violences, and also the forging together of a collective we that isn't naturally there. So just to reiterate some of the main conclusions of my project and kind of main through lines, I was interested in exploring the web as a site of social performance and political cohesion, the circulation of shock as a political strategy and effect that reaches across partisan lines, and underlying an unquestioned nationalism that animates the left and the right. And so this picture right here is from a kind of in the aftermath at a Hillary rally right after the results of the election were announced, and these like very mournful flags for me kind of prompt the question, what happens to shock after it settles? Where does shock go? Shock is like a very unstable feeling. We can only be shocked for so long, and I'm interested in what that kind of transforms into and the emotional work that kind of its aftermath does as well. So it's like kind of the half-life of shock. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for listening to me. Next up is my friend Rania Sadiq.
I'm gonna get water really quick. Oh, thank you. Where's the sticker? Unbelievable. Okay. Hi everybody. My name is Rania, and my thesis is called At What Cost? Women of Color Therapists and Emotional Labor. So, the main question of my thesis is, how do women of color therapists perform, experience, and negotiate emotional labor in their work and in their life? So the reason why I chose to do this thesis is because, number one, I'm really passionate about therapy. I've been in therapy for a few years and it's been great. I think everyone should do it. I took a class with Professor Pittman last year, and we talked a lot about affective or emotional labor, and I found it really interesting. And then I found myself thinking about how therapy and emotional labor are connected, and also how women of color therapists specifically experience this. And so that is what led me to writing this thesis. So to give a little bit of background, what is emotional labor? Emotional labor is a term that was coined by the American sociologist Arlie Hochschild in 1983 in her book, The Managed Heart. And it is defined as labor that requires one to induce or suppress feeling in order to sustain the outward countenance that produces the proper state of mind in others. So most of the literature that is on emotional labor stems from her work, and it surrounds workers mainly in the service industry. So like thinking about like the cashier who has to maintain a very specific outward persona to do their job despite what they actually might be feeling, just because that's what they're expected to do. So here's a little comic to kind of like sum up what emotional labor is and what that looks like. So there's this guy, he's at Sandwich World, and he said, "I thought the girl was flirting with me when she made my sandwich, took my money, and called me honey. So imagine my embarrassment when she made a sandwich and took money from the next guy and called him honey too. Sigh, she's such a gold digger." So this is like kind of like showing like sort of like what that looks like in the service industry, and also speaks to the way that emotional labor is a very gendered thing. So yeah. So some of the existing literature that is on emotional labor, like I said, stems from Hochschild's original theories, and a prevailing theory or prevailing idea is that those who perform emotional labor experience that it seeps from their work into their lives. And that's something that I have found to be true in my results, which I will talk about later, but also is something that I want to interrogate a little bit further because it's more complicated than that. Something else that I was thinking about when looking through the existing literature is the fact that there's very, very little research on connecting emotional labor and race. And I found this especially troubling considering the fact that there are very specific forms of emotional labor that women of color specifically are forced to perform every day, from staying cool, calm, and collected in the face of racist microaggressions, having to take on the responsibility of educating white people about their identity, and so on and so forth. So then I also looked at literature on caring labor specifically. And caring labor encompasses jobs such as therapy, elderly care, caring for the disabled, child care, and things like that. And so care work is a type of emotional labor, but the reason it differs from the types of emotional labor that I discussed before is because it usually involves establishing and maintaining a prolonged, long-term relationship with clients, rather than what ends up being the more transitory nature of jobs in the service industry. And as a result, interactions with clients feel less commodified and can end up being more fulfilling. So yeah, and then I'm just gonna go a little bit into my methods for this thesis. So what I did was I interviewed 7 women of color therapists who I found through just people that I know, also through the Therapy for Black Girls directory and the Queer and Trans Therapists of Color Network directory online. And then once I had all my interviews done, I color-coded them based on these 13 themes that you see here. So some of them would be the orange one is setting boundaries, people's experiences in graduate school and training, or expectations that come with being a woman of color therapist. So I'm actually going to read one of the quotes from one of my interviewees about boundary setting. So she said, "I can't be a therapist 24/7. In my personal relationships, I just can't be the therapist. The professional cap that I put on, which requires certain boundaries, requires certain boundaries. So there's all these expectations in being a woman of color where it's oh, you're a woman of color and you're a therapist. Do you want to hear all of my problems?" And I'm no, I'm not. Your therapist wants to hear all of your problems. So that area, I think, can get tricky at times in terms of others' expectations of me, and then also taking a step back and reminding myself that I chose to do this as a profession, and this requires certain structural hygiene in order for it to be an effective process, and that can happen in my personal life. So this really speaks so the person who I interviewed, her name is Amanda, and she's really just highlighting the idea that therapy is designed to be this very particular space, and that's where it's supposed to stay. And she intentionally like creates very strict boundaries because otherwise she can't do her job properly. And that's what she means when she says structural hygiene. So I'm going to go a little bit into more into my results. So I divided my results into two parts, emotional labor inside of work and then emotional labor outside of work. So in terms of what happens in the therapeutic space itself, I learned that a lot of the therapists I spoke to work through like a relational approach or what they called an anti-oppressive or intersectional approach. So the relational approach, like what that looks like is the therapist expressing very transparent and authentic emotions with their clients. Just like being really real and sort of modeling that and showing their clients that it's okay to like express like how you really feel. And then another thing they do would be like actually like directly implicating themselves into the session and like asking questions like after the client says something, being like, how do you think I feel about what you just said? So like really just like putting themselves into the session and as a result like making sure it's more of a back and forth, like mutual conversation rather than just like a one-sided thing. And then a lot of the therapists also spoke about the difficulties they had with this kind of approach. Experiences with feeling triggered or feeling upset or like deeply affected by something their client said and how hard that can be, but then also talking about how that improves over time, and that's like a continual process that takes like hard work. And then as for the anti-oppressive or intersectional, or also some called it like a feminist approach to therapy, what that means is that the therapists I spoke to were like very intentional about bringing up matters of identity and power and privilege within the therapeutic space because they recognize that these are things that will affect the dynamic in the space and it makes sense to like bring them up. So that was actually really interesting to me because like as I heard more about like this like anti-oppressive approach, I realized like that's an added form of emotional labor that I wasn't like expecting to hear about. Like there's a labor in like talking about matters of power and privilege that is like that happens in addition to like the things that are already like set in place. So in terms of the emotional labor outside of work, therapists spoke about their experiences in training and grad school programs, as well as the general like expectations that are placed on women of color, and then also the importance of boundaries. So some of the like phrases that they used were like they talked about like friends, family, and acquaintances making them feel like they're like this like 24/7 caretaker, or like one of my interviewees talked about how she has to like carry all of these burdens and like hold people's trauma because she has to like fulfill this role of like being the South Asian daughter. And then like one of my other interviewees, Maya, talked about how as a black woman she has to fulfill this like manly stereotype of like holding everyone else's pain and like having to have this like outward persona of like being totally fine with it and like being happy with that because that's what she's just expected to do. So yeah, that's some of the things they talked about. And then also like in like training programs in grad school, like having to like, because like a lot of the curriculums were like very like didn't really like touch on issues affecting like people of color, they had to like do the labor of like talking about like issues regarding like race and identity, and it was like the responsibility was like placed on them. And then finally, the importance of boundaries. So I'm gonna like talk a little bit more about that in my important findings. So I like found that through my interviews, I found that women of color therapists do indeed have to perform large amounts of emotional labor inside and outside of work. However, I found more positive associations with this emotional labor due to the deep and intimate relationships formed with clients. And like a huge reason why this is the case is because the therapists are very intentional about how they set boundaries. A lot of the therapists I spoke to talked about therapy as something that provides rather than takes away structure. And many describe therapy as a sacred space that's designed, as I said before, to do a very particular thing. And it's unfair to both the therapist and the client to try to bring that into personal interactions because it's just like not going to be the same and is not going to be helpful for either party. And another thing that the therapist I spoke to said is that they think that all therapists should be in therapy themselves, that they need this space outside of the therapy session to process their emotions because they're feeling things too and they need somewhere to put that and to work through all of that. I'm just going to read a quote by one of the people that I interviewed, Nadia. She said, "I think that being a therapist has helped me set boundaries. What's nice about therapy is that there's a structure. People come to your office, people come on time, they leave on time, they pay you on time. It's just something that's very structured. It actually allows you to see when boundaries are crossed even more, and I think that actually helps me in my daily life." So I think that really sums that up and also speaks to what Amanda had said earlier about the structural hygiene that is inherent in therapy. To echo that point, a lot of the therapists spoke about how if boundaries are not established and maintained, it's impossible to be a good therapist. The thing about boundaries was really interesting to me because going into this thesis, I had a vague idea, I figured it's important for therapists to set boundaries, but it's something that all of them were very serious about, and all of them made a point to bring up, and I wasn't expecting that, but I think it makes a lot of sense. I just want to conclude this thesis by hopefully, for me at least, this thesis has helped me to rethink the way that I conceptualize the work that women of color therapists do. One of my interviewees was talking about how people in her life are your job is just sitting there and listening to people, and that's all you do. But that's not it. There's a lot more. And really just recognizing all of the work and energy and the very particular type of work and energy that goes into this job for women of color therapists, I think is really important. And then on a larger level, just ascribing more value to care work in general. Care work has historically been devalued for a number of reasons, the main one being that it's typically women's work. But I'm hoping that with this thesis and with work along similar lines, that we can just see it for what it really is. But yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much. The next presenter is going to be David.
My name is David, David Sierra. I'm a graduating senior in Columbia College. Completed my thesis through the Institute for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality across the street. but also want to just like say a huge thank you to Barnard at WGSS and to the Barnard Center for Research on Women, who have been amazing, nurturing, fostering like centers of study and care and community for me. My thesis today is entitled Transitive Sense, as you can see, Trans Aesthetics and the Politics of Organization. I want to also start off with a few things. I want to ground in things, just first off. That's why I'm starting with these. But to Jack Halberstam, who isn't here today, who advised my thesis, to Christina Mercer and Patricia Daly for overlooking and helping out in the thesis seminars, and then to folks at Earwags, especially Khadija Belli, for always organizing things, and to Sharon Harris over at the Institute for Research in African American Studies, and then also to all of my friends who are here in the audience today, and all of the professors and instructors who have been so generous and loving. So let's get started. So as I'm starting with the transitive, how does this work? This way? Yep, okay, so we're going to start with transitivity. Just a little bit of a grammar lesson, as one of my favorite professors, Tina Kemp, has taught me to start with a lot of things. So transitivity, grammatically thinking about something that can take a direct object, right? But then transposing transitivity into philosophical discourse kind of moves into something that's a bit more receptive and a bit more fluid than something that just takes a direct object or is on the receiving end as an othering end. When it's transposed into more expansive terms, transitivity in my theories and in the way that I've been trying to work through it might allow for a more expansive and more caring practice towards gender and gendering and practicing transness, practicing political transness, practicing a political entanglement with transness and all of the subsidiary and corollary identities that are connected. As we're moving from transitivity, I really want to move into practice. As you might have noticed, I was talking about it a lot. Michel Desserteaux writes, "Many everyday practices are tactical in character." My project aspires to enact practices of tactical operations, lexical and syntactical analyses, sensorial engagements, embodied knowledges, and political critiques. These pillars support a diffused examination of logics, rhetorics, and choreographies of organization and movement, including minoritarian gestures wrought through the transitive sense, passing out of itself, passing over to or affecting something else, operating beyond itself. A tactic, a calculus, which cannot count on a proper or spatial or institutional localization, as Desserteaux notes. A strategy, he notes, however, assumes a place that can be circumscribed as proper, also proper in the French sense, to tidy, to clean, to correct as a verb, and thus serves as the basis for generating relations with an exterior distinct from its competitors and adversaries, clienteles, targets, or objects of research. Political, economic, and scientific rationality have been constructed on this strategic model. Management and administration operate as two modes of state strategy in the projects of nation building, maintenance, and expansion. Administrative violence is a significatory expression used in Dean Spade's development of his framework of a critical trans politics. This is a particular frame for understanding how processes of gendered racialization are congealed in violent institutions. This line of thinking and organizing is informed by critical race theory's critiques of legal reform and specifically anti-discrimination laws, and has important links to analyses developed by fat politics and disability politics, where norms about body and health are identified and critiqued. Administrative violence operates through those registers which mark quotidian yet determining events. Administrative violence encompasses those calculated procedural actions of the state underwritten by juridical authority and sovereign discipline. Through this disciplinary iteration of liberal governance and administrative violence, autonomous subjectivity, bodily sovereignty, and suspicion of xenobiotics in bodies are all dogmatically and interdependently maintained. The work of maintenance is carried out through operations which, as Jasri Puar asserts, in relation to transnormative medical discourses and modes of becoming and thinking with the work of Mao Chen, piece bodies together, or create bodies with or without new organs. The matrix body, by way of medical individuation and its discourses produced by Enlightenment thought, is yoked in synecdoche to the state. Persistent individuation disciplines bodies into possessive subjects, expressive actors, and volitional constituents of the state. The state choreography operates through prescriptive approaches to embodiment, codifying bodies as single or enclosed forms, simultaneously able to stand in for, be heard by, affect change to or in, and expand the state. There is a binary manufacture between individual and population, which might be defined as a generalized abstraction, signifying a collection of bodies to be regulated. The individual within the population is subject to will, rationality, or juridical status, which Hagar Kotef notes as subject abstraction in her book Movement and the Ordering of Freedom on Liberal Governances of Mobility. Abstraction, then, transitively, also produces populations. The word population is deployed in state rhetorics primarily through administrative, juridical, economic, and military procedures. Populations, bodies of bodies, through their production, necessitate management. The technology which transposes bodies of bodies into populations to be managed is, Kotef points out, movement. Regulated movement is a technology of citizenship or subjectivity through which plurality becomes a body, a social movement, an empire, a state, as orchestrated collective movement. The strategic rationalizations of management are those I take tactical aim at in tracing those logics, rhetorics, and choreographies of organization deployed by neoliberal states and their constituent institutions. I take my own medications as the point from which I begin my theoretical and artistic analysis. I began medical transition in fall 2017 and quickly discovered at that point that estradiol, synthetic estrogen used for medical transition, is manufactured in and distributed by Teva Pharmaceuticals, the world's largest generic drug corporation based, operated, and owned in Israel. Okay, so this part is going to be a bit more improv. I just wanted to read a bit of the prose that I'd actually put hours into writing for all of you. But tracing is a concept that I've been working through as I've been talking about these state choreographies, right? Like these movements and developments that states put together to regulate populations. I'm thinking about that, thinking about the ways that we might be able to subvert or revert or divert those things, right? So the ability to use tracing then maybe as a kind of a counterproductive mode to the state, right? Using tracing to figure out what's happening, using tracing to figure out the choreographies that the state is making before they make those choreographies. So I'm thinking about normative power then as I have next to it. Normative power developing through the establishing and regulation of norms. How those norms are producing then those populations that I was talking about earlier, right? So the states and those norms within those states are using technologies of incorporation then. So I'm thinking about how capitalism, for instance, as a system, continually works to incorporate modes of relationality and connectivity into it to capitalize off of those modes of connectivity and relationality. So how then can we create other modes that evade that? Are we able to create other modes that evade that as minoritarian individuals, as trans people, as people who are targeted by the state in different ways? Those are the things that I'm just trying to work through theoretically. But then I got to reading Testo Junkie by Paul Preciado. And in Testo Junkie, one of the assertions that I found that stuck out to me quite a bit was the assertion that bodies are resistant and resistive at a molecular level, which I kind of disagree with. And so I took that to point and wanted to deconstruct and reconstruct some arguments around it. And what I got to then was thinking about circulation. So this is Twitter. These are some of my tweets from my Twitter, which is a fake Twitter. Princess Die High, at Queer Negativity, if you want to follow me, I won't accept. So I asked rhetorically, question time, does anyone else get at least a little fucked up about the fact that I basically have a completely different body than 9 months ago because of flammable synthetic catalysts floating around my circulatory system? What the fuck? Also, there's an artist who graduated from Columbia University named Sarah Serpa who takes estradiol and puts it all over things and then sets those things on fire, which is really cool. So Andrea responded, "We are chemical reactions floating in stardust." I responded a gif of a penguin falling over into the ice. That was my reaction. And it obviously was a silly exchange a couple weeks ago as I was preparing for another event talk thing that I was doing, but it really prompted me to think about circulation and movement in ways that might connect to quantum physics and ways that might connect to space and spatiality. And I got really excited, and then I had to pull myself back like I always do when I'm researching things and try to figure out what was a manageable topic to actually take on. And then I moved into actually analyzing my own pills and the way that they circulate through my body when I take them every morning. So these are the pills that I take. Estradiol, which is synthetic estrogen, as I said, and then spironolactone and sertraline, which is the generic word for Zoloft, because a girl is depressed on this campus. So from there, I just want to talk a little bit about what those pills are doing, right? So estrogen, when it enters a body, is also an organic material. These pills aren't just things that disseminate throughout my body. They're things that have their own lifespans in my body. They have their own bodies. They have their own moving and changing parts to them, and my body affects them just as they affect my body. So one thing that I found out that has been really, really affected by estradiol is this thing called fascia, not fascism, fascia. And fascia is this weird collagen-type substance that is kind of just all around. It is like the interstitial parts of our bodies. Like it's the stuff that keeps our organs like up in our bodies. Otherwise, they would just kind of fall and like sink to our feet, right? They are these weird little cells that are really connective. People don't really know exactly how they are connecting different things within a body, but they keep it together. So then I was like, wow, these things are actual just like support systems that we have in our bodies. And I thought that was really cool and like really lovely and poetic, but obviously there's also a bad side to everything. And the fascia in my body is always moving around, especially with, your fascia is also moving around, sorry about it. But especially with estrogen, the fascia that is on my face, that's under my skin, that's moving around my hips and my butt, it's all moving. And it sounds painful, and it kind of is, but like in a way that's pretty prolonged, right? In a way that's just something that you learn to live with as a pain that kind of emerges 1 week over a span of time that you don't really notice, and then you just learn to move through it. So all of these things are to say, as I move onward from my pills, is that the existence of matter, right, of the existence of molecules, as Preciado asserts that they're resistant, I don't think that that existence is necessarily inherently resistant or resistive to anything. So I'm thinking about the existence of material not being important in this, but the mode of its organization. The mode by which that organization then codes it as transgressive or repressive, regulatory or liberatory. Not to say that each of these are discrete categories, but more specifically, that material oscillates elastically through and between categories imposed upon them. 1 minute. So as we keep going, I then take up gender as an analytic category through all of these things, naturally, because I'm talking about hormones and my own transness. So as I'm talking about gender, I'm using all of these tracing kind of methodologies that I've developed to interrogate these main categories: etymology, visuality, nomenclature, taxonomies, and prescriptions. Gender itself, in a certain way, is this Enlightenment discourse, right? It's produced as a norm in that discourse, and then is dominant through that discourse, is a hegemony. So I was just tracing how gender works through words, and different words that we deploy around gender and what those mean. Then I moved to visuality, because we code people through visuality when it comes to gender often, right? People pass or don't pass because of visuality. People are able to be legible or illegible because of visuality. Then to nomenclature, which is a more specific mode of naming. nomenclature as a scientific method developed in the Enlightenment, so deconstructing that and figuring out ways that we might leverage nomenclature politically, and then we could also continue to critique nomenclature. Taxonomies as, again, a little categorically different from nomenclature, and then prescriptions, talking about prescriptive approaches to embodiment, to gender, and then my own medical prescriptions as well. So that is most of my thesis. And I would like to
Okay, if I could invite the entire panel back up, we have a few minutes for questions. Yeah. Comments, questions? Otherwise, I'll give the minutes to our panelists so they can keep going. Bob. Yeah?
Timmy, do you have a question? Oh, okay. All right. Yeah.
Comments or questions? Yeah?
So thank you. These were amazing presentations. My question is directed at David, and I already kind of know the answer to this because we've talked about it extensively in the context of our seminar and also one-on-one conversation. But and you were kind of moving towards this in the final section of your presentation. You talk about molecules not being inherently transgressive or inherently oppositional to any kind of state form. And it's more about the organization, the way kind of matter gets, mobilized into certain political formations. And, so you're actually kind of moving against this kind of like Deleuzian term, thinking of like the molecular, at the level of matter as or the substrate of resistance that kind of eludes or evades a kind of human emotive relationality as a site of resistance. So I was thinking if you could link that up with, the kind of circulatory notions of affect that also that Izzy was talking about, and how if we think about affect, are there like resistant affects? Are there, or can we, if we can't encode resistance to anything human or non-human, like where do we draw our kind of political or resistant potential, if that makes sense. I don't know.
So I'll give you, David, do you want to start, and then maybe Izzy, you can, yeah, sure. I'm not good.
I guess I just don't really like the idea that anything is inherent in anything, right? That anything is inherently like resistant or anything is inherently going to do something. Obviously particles move on like self-moving, like that's a thing that happens in science, is affirm that to certain terms. But a lot of my thesis was taking up science, and not against science specifically, but taking up science to task, to test its limits, just as you might test any other analytic category, and not affirming science as a truth, right? So then that allowed me to get into the space of tracing circulation, not necessarily as an actualized thing that is happening, but as a theory of circulation in the body. I'm not saying that the movement of my fascia under my skin because of my estrogen is actually happening on a molecular level, like because X, Y, Z. We can all say that these things are happening, but does anyone actually know, right? Like that's the whole thing. That's why I got into 20,000 arguments in contemporary civilization over the fact that science is not necessarily concrete. And I think affect is that kind of overlapping term that really was helpful to me to see the ways in which things could circulate.
This is a really interesting question. I think I'm going to look at it through the lens of the criticism that I'm steeped in, which is critical technology studies. So part of my paper is looking at the similarities between computing ontology and kind of neoliberal structures of enclosure and stratification, especially in kind of in the way that the revolutions of 1968 were foreclosed by the specific geographic laying out of cities like Watts and Detroit. And so kind of some of the scholars that I'm drawing from are talking about how modularity as kind of the separation of code into discrete modules in order to kind of then connect and run a function they're constructed insofar as you can take out a piece that's malfunctioning and then kind of reassert another piece. And so there's like this, even though it's flexible, even though it's kind of open to change, like there's still, the change is only functional insofar as it supports the function that it was originally designed to do. And so, I mean, I'm not to like break down code, but like, I feel like in those fissures there's something there, like the absence is also a presence in some way, and like in that the code can be kind of destructed. But this is maybe more complicated than I got into right now, so.
I don't have anything to say. But thank you.
Hi. So, great job, everyone. Really enjoyed your presentations a lot.
Thank you.
So, my question is probably more directed at Izzy and Rania, but of course, we would love to hear what you have to say. So, you know, in Rania's presentation, Rania, talked about how, you know, if we are to place, like, you know, therapy in, like, this day and age where there are more, like, apps coming up about therapy, so, like, Talkspace and, like, something better, something, I'm not sure what it's called, but, you know, apps like that, how does that basically, like, how do we see the shift, like, of emotional labor moving from women of color, and like how does that connect to like cybernetic sociology? Like what's going on here?
Rania, what do you want to hear?
Wow, that is a very interesting question. Thank you. So, you know, that's something that I haven't really thought about a lot, but I think, I guess, like drawing from like my interviews and everything that I learned from all of the women of color therapists that I spoke to, you know, honestly, I don't really know what that could look like. It's not something that I've like thought about enough to like envision, and like a lot of the emotional labor that the therapists perform, like that's something that happens in like, you know, like that face-to-face setting, and like that's really fascinating because like what could that even look like when we introduce like technology into this, when we like digitize these things? Like, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I think I'm gonna have to like think about that more, but we can have a conversation about this later one-on-one. Yeah, yeah, I'll call you. Oh yeah, of course.
And when you asked that question, the thing that I thought of was, I guess, Ronnie, you showed me this, but like mood tracking apps, where you kind of like, you know, you just like, okay, today I'm feeling despondent, or today I'm feeling ecstatic, and it's like the kind of contraction of affect, which in my kind of idea of it is like so muddy and so illegible in a lot of ways, and kind of I can only begin to understand it through the work that it does, rather than any like qualitative understanding of it. So I mean, these apps, like when Rania showed me that app, I was like so shook. Yeah. I just and I mean, I think, I don't know, it's a question like how, like, do we modulate kind of data on emotions, and what does that produce through its organization? Yeah.
I think we're going to give the panelists a hand. question occurs to you, afterwards there'll be time for mixing and mingling after all the panelists are done, so you can get a chance to ask them. Okay, we're going to start our second panel now, which is on neoliberalism and gender, and I would like to introduce Emma May, who's going to be speaking about the woke brand.
Hello. So today I'm going to talk about my thesis, A Woke Brand, Independent Media, and the Mainstreaming of Feminism. So responding to a sense of political urgency within readers, mainstream media outlets are covering the previously taboo subject of feminism. Rosalind Gill, a sociologist at the University of London, posits, quote, "Where a few years ago it sometimes felt difficult to make any feminist arguments stick in the media, today it seems as everything is a feminist issue. Feminism has a new luminosity in popular culture." In my research, I found from 2005 to 2015, feminism and feminists appeared in Teen Vogue's print publication only 12 times. But between 1 year, 2016 and 2017, the words feminism and feminist appear in the publication a record number of 40 times. So the popularization of feminism has resulted in the upsurge of choice feminism, which scholar Shelley Bungeon defines as, it describes perspectives which share an orientation to feminist politics informed by the interpretation of freedom as the capacity to make individual choices. And I guess more simply said, it valorizes the individual and the individual's capacity of choice. Bungeon states that the co-optation of feminist politics, quote, creates the appearance that progressive gender relations have been achieved while curbing the perception that a more radical agenda for change is possible. And this new form of feminism has taken up the term of intersectionality, a term that was founded in feminist or in radical feminist politics, and kind of co-opted it to mean inclusion. So intersectionality is a term that has been taken up by mainstream media publications. The term was coined by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, and it is meant to illustrate that identities gain and produce meaning through each other. Unlike its Teen Vogue version, intersectionality is much more complicated than a means to communicate inclusion of, and this is from a Teen Vogue article, all women from different backgrounds. According to the theory of intersectionality, the production of race and gender do not develop independently, intersecting only in particular bodies or locations. Rather, identities such as race, class, gender, and ability, as well as systems of dominations, are inseparable and overlap and intersect in multiple and shifting locales. A precursor to this theory of intersectionality is the Combahee River Collective statement, written by a group of Black feminists to explain the necessity to develop a movement that is anti-capitalist, anti-racist, and feminist. According to this statement, the only way in which liberation can be achieved is through a movement that encompasses all of these frameworks. Intersectionality, as a term in mainstream media, is utilized to mean inclusion, and intersectional feminism in mainstream media is, of course, inherently not anti-capitalist. So for my thesis, I interviewed 6 different feminist media makers, and I also consulted literature in the Barnard Zine Library and the special collections. I wanted to highlight the collective-based anti-capitalist feminist media making that serves as a contrast to and contradictorily an inspiration of present-day corporate and mainstream media. Through these discussions with creators of various types of media, I aim to show the multiplicity of the forms and politics of feminist independent media today. The focus of this project is studying the ways in which independent media works to foster networks of individuals, create sites of opposition to capitalism, complicate binaries between that which is underground and that which is mainstream, and form sites of possibility for creativity and coalition building. And although the networks of producers and consumers of independent feminist media are sites of possibility in terms of creative anti-capitalist solutions to media making, they are not entirely liberated from the overall capitalist structures of society. So first, I'm going to go through an interview that I did with Meg Wachter of a Brooklyn-based magazine called Got a Girl Crush. So the magazine was founded online, and although it was founded online, the founder, Meg Wachter, prefers print. She says that she prefers print media because it, quote, feels that it is more archival and more tangible. When we do online, it's like shouting into the void. And she's also had trouble funding her magazine. They've done a Kickstarter, and they've also tried to make a magazine subscription service, but in doing so, she's made no profit off of the magazine, and in the future hopes to make enough money so that she can pay contributors. She says that this frustration about making money plays most out at zine fairs, oddly, where people are generally more comfortable in spending $10 on an enamel pin than $18 on a magazine. She says, quote, it's only an $8 difference, and one thing took a year to make. Magazines have more value of the two. No one buys zines and magazines, which is totally ironic and a bummer. And I don't really believe this, but including that anyway. So I also interviewed Andy Zeisler of the feminist magazine, Bitch Magazine. She founded the magazine online in Oakland, California, alongside Lisa Jervis. So Bitch Magazine is a feminist publication and media organization based in Portland, Oregon. The organization has no corporate sponsorship, and the only advertisements in the magazine are for feminist-oriented businesses. Rather, the magazine is funded by the Beehive, which is a group of monthly donors that provide most of the magazine's funding. And Zeisler Zeisler interestingly describes the Beehive as not just readers, but stakeholders. And she says that reader education and teaching readers about how the magazine gets made and maintaining a sense of transparency and community is what's most important in what she does, rather than making funds off of the magazine. Great. And lastly, I interviewed Ali Maloney, who is the current news and politics editor at Teen Vogue, which is owned by mass media conglomerate Condé Nast. Ali Maloney grew up in the small community of Pittsboro, North Carolina, and she grew up in the DIY community, and she says that she's, quote, indebted to that community. So through her work at Teen Vogue, she hopes to bring radical and DIY politics and sensibility to her audience of many millions of readers and viewers. She says that she describes herself as a gatekeeper, and that ability is important to elevate the voice of young people and also radical and marginalized voices. She says that she sees this interesting sense of urgency and political awareness in contemporary youth that she hasn't seen in many years, and as an editor, she hopes to lend a platform to them. Nonetheless, she described a lot of difficulties with her work, mainly the many steps to publishing a piece at a corporate media company, which involves copy editing, fact-checking, lawyers, and she says, moreover, which I think sums it up quite well, if it wouldn't serve the company to put that information in the world, we won't publish it. Independent media doesn't have those barriers. That's what makes it unique. So through my research and through my various interviews, I've really come to the conclusion that independent media creates this community of readers that are not only just readers, they're stakeholders. It has less barriers for publication. There aren't any lawyers or fact checkers or copy editors of a zine. And it challenges the idea that young people are merely consumers and provides outlets for creativity and meaning making for young people to create and envision new worlds. Thank you. Next have Sophia Q. Sellers.
So, continuing the panel entitled, the panel about neoliberalism, my project is called Whose University? Student Organizations and the Paradoxes of Neoliberalism, and it is a critical examination of the student group All-Sex, also known as Columbia Barnard All-Sex. So, first, my kind of guiding questions are, can a group that is founded and perpetuated within a university space offer a means of conceptualizing the future against and kind of outside of the prevailing logic of that space? In addition, how is this paradox experienced and recounted by those in All-Sex? So this project is about kind of paradox as well as the politics of belonging within a university context, as elucidated by interviews conducted with members of the All-Sex community. So my goal is to kind of expand a critical understanding of the mechanics of the All-Sex community and deepen the body of scholarship on this organization. So firstly, for those of you who were not at thesis presentations last year, what is All-Sex? All-Sex is an organization founded 8 years ago by students and modeled after a student-run class at Berkeley. From the mission statement, it is a peer-facilitated, semester-long discussion group dedicated to the empowerment and fulfillment of the sexual self. All-Sex aims to create an inclusive, safe, and diverse community that fosters the sexual growth of its participants by adopting an intersectional approach to examine the external and internal forces that control our sexuality, drawing primarily on the lived experience of the participants and their individual potential for learning and understanding. So, and in addition to this helpful image that's right there. So one time kind of doing All-Sex or participating in All-Sex consists of engagement in a semester-long curriculum made up of 19 parts, as pictured there, each with its own topical focus, such as, for example, gender identity or sexual practices. Each meeting for a specific subject discussion lasts for 2 hours and consists of several different kinds of exercises, loosely guided conversations, writing prompts, and activities where group members interact with each other and move around the room. After having participated for at least once for one semester, a person can apply to be a facilitator. Each section has 2 to 3 facilitators who actively participate in section but are also tasked with monitoring section dynamics, guidance of group exercises. The facilitators, in addition, edit the curriculum and choose new facilitators. As a current All-Sex facilitator, I've been involved for the past 3 years in this organization for a majority of my college career, and my stake in this project comes from the belief that the work that All-Sex does is incredibly important as a group that seeks to make accessible, supportive, and kind of holistic conversations about sex and sexuality. The existence of All-Sex plays a crucial role in the well-being and kind of growth of those who exist on this campus. In addition, at its core, All-Sex is founded on an ideology of self-reflection and critique. Therefore, this project fits well, in my opinion, within the ethos of that organization. So, contextualizing this work, while, of course, my thesis goes much deeper into the kind of framing theories, we know 3 things. 1, universities are neoliberal institutions. And come and talk to me more about that after if you want to know the in-depth thing, but for the purpose of the presentation. And neoliberalism is multifaceted, the social project of neoliberalism, with which my thesis is primarily concerned, consists of kind of broadly free market logic kind of bleeding into social relationships. Such as, for example, concepts of individualism, consumerism, and hierarchy within educational models. And those in turn kind of regulating people and creating self-regulating neoliberal subjects. In addition, within the university, there are many different ways in which people seek to challenge this paradigm, including radical pedagogy and campus activism. But groups like All-Sex are particularly interesting to me because their challenge is aimed at transforming kind of selves in addition to communities. My methodology was that I conducted 7 interpretive and kind of in-depth interviews with 3 current facilitators, 2 past facilitators, 1 current participant, and 1 past participant. They were conducted over the course of this past school year, and were kind of, while they did not follow the same question and answer kind of path each time, they were loosely structured around several themes and kind of consisted of like a critical engagement with my own experience of all sex as well as theirs, and kind of talked it out. So my findings essentially consist of the way in which all sex interacts with the neoliberal university. So firstly, how all sex can offer kind of alternatives to neoliberal modes and kind of logics. As one interviewee said, all sex essentially consists of engagement with the political aspect, the personal aspect, and the kind of relationship community aspect. As a community founded in kind of the dynamic of critique and care, it seeks to, or it serves to, according to the words of my interviewees, it serves to complicate normative ideals, engage directly with stigma and vulnerability, and center both care and accountability. So while I will not have time to go through all of those, I've chosen essentially to talk about the way in which all sex does the first thing through the example of a person who as a member of the facilitator group, joined all sex early on in their college career. Upon entering Barnard, the person believed that in much of the rhetoric, the university rhetoric, that community occurs naturally without personal commitment, and that people are made up of kind of, and that people, and that colleges are made up of kind of wholly like-minded individuals, where kind of, so my, the quote is, "From far away, it's really easy to build whatever idea you think college, especially Barnard, is going to be. I experienced a lot of ridicule in high school for having whatever was seen as liberal-esque views and was really itching for people to take me seriously. I thought that just being at Barnard would facilitate that, but that's not true, and it takes more work than that. Realizing that Barnard itself isn't the community of your dreams, I think, is hard as a first year." So this person is expressing kind of several things. Firstly, that obviously there's the kind of transition from just being at Barnard not being enough, and that it takes more work than that, but also the important idea that as kind of this happened for this person in all sex, it's the idea that a person can kind of come to that realization but not spend too much time in the kind of unproductive guilt of like feeling bad about the like their liberal-esque views or their previous views on what community consisted of, and instead all sex was able to facilitate the idea that it's actually kind of great that you're in this community that isn't all you. Yes, so, however, all sex also replicates several violent neoliberal structures, specifically expressed through, in my interviews, through the way in which it deals with stagnation and kind of guilt around the representation of identities within the all sex community. So when conversations around the cisnormativity and whiteness specifically of all sex would come up, there was kind of hesitation as to how to deal with that, and that the kind of dynamic nature of the organization did not always was not always able to kind of promote conversations around that. In addition, people sometimes talked about the inaccessible or proselytizing educational model. So while all sex is inherently supposed to be this kind of facilitator, participant, dynamic educational model, often it was expressed as like, what are we kind of giving to people? And also sometimes curriculum editing does not entirely take into account the way in which people are not always able to access the space in the same way. And third, there was kind of work of individualism and ownership that dealt with kind of the boundary policing of like what the all-sex space was allowed to look like. So, and that's actually what I'm going to be specifically focusing on, the way in which all sex exists as like a therapeutic space. So, a consistent thread throughout my interviews was a struggle to define what kind of space all sex should be and what the role of the facilitator is in defining this space. Facilitators, or like the group of facilitators as a whole, rarely ever oust participants from an individual section against their wishes. The process of deciding whether or not an individual participant will leave section is supposed to always be a mutual agreement with the ultimate goal of the participant's well-being. However, this is not always the case. The instances in which facilitators have enacted this ejection have been points of contention between my interviewees and between my interviewees and myself. Each person I interviewed had a slightly different rationale for why, in an extreme circumstance, a participant would be asked to leave, with their answer for the most part lying along the lines of their individual ideological beliefs as to what all sex consists of. So one commonly invoked explanation, however, was the idea that all sex is not therapy. So this quote, I think it's not a space where we come in and we're like, okay, so what's on your mind today? Like, it's not really, often I've noticed that if someone is using all sex in a traditional therapy way, you'll notice, because the way that they talk will always return to where their heads are at, whatever bad place that might be. Things will circle back to that. So while it is important to note that all sex facilitators are not trained in any kind of professional or concrete way to deal with like certain emotions and certain behaviors that people might be going through, my view, and this is not shared by everyone who I interviewed, is that a true challenge to neoliberalism would be a communal approach to defining a space and a communal means of addressing individual needs, such as therapy. Of course, there are limitations to this, specifically within an all-sex space, but kind of monopolization over the control over defining a space is a form of hierarchy and kind of a centering of individualism and exclusivity. So conclusions. Essentially, my project looks at how all sex is able to manage the paradox of neoliberalism, challenging institution from within that institution through the methods of kind of critique and care. Essentially, the ways in which it has been transformative to people have been its ability to both critique structures and kind of feelings that people are having, as well as create a kind of care-centered community aspect where people are able to interact with each other and kind of learn more about themselves and those around them. However, there are pockets of hierarchy, individualism, and exclusion, as I've stated, within this space. But the great thing is that there is growth inherent, there are possibilities for growth always inherent within an all-sex structure, and possibilities for dialogue. So people who are facilitators can come and talk to me about how they feel about this. Essentially, however, neoliberalism is strong and pervasive in the university environment and in our greater culture, and we can see that influence. And my goal here is to more elucidate the mechanisms at work and deconstruct to some degree the conditions with which those involved in all sex seem poised to confront some things with self-consciousness, but also to kind of create certain mythologies. And my recommendations, though, I mean, again, we can really all talk about this, is that all sex should take the time to learn about and acknowledge its history, engage with both positive and negative feedback of those who have participated in it, engage in a coalition-building model of collaboration with other organizations that share its goals, both on campus and in the greater New York City area, and be clear and assertive about the future that the group is interested in helping create.
And I think when discussed about kind of those other entities involved with particularly the process of publication, that wasn't necessarily seen as a means of accountability, but rather as barriers in talking about what they really wanted to say or what they thought needed to be said. And I think in terms of using the phrase like of accountability, although I didn't really get into this in my research and my thesis, I know as a fact, like in the zine community particularly, there is a process of accountability and a community of readers that really, I guess, hold each other to high standards. Like, for instance, if somebody says something problematic, or if there is kind of a conflict that's often played out through other zines or through like online mechanisms such as Twitter. But I guess throughout my thesis, this layer of like lawyers, fact checkers, and other like or broadly represented corporate interests and barriers rather than accountability. I don't know if that makes sense.
I lost my train of thought during editing, but I'm here for accountability.
Any other questions? Yeah, accountability. Yeah.
I was also a facilitator this semester, and I participated in LSACs. And yeah, I don't know. I'm really glad you addressed like the issues with like, so I guess the people's hesitancy with like not engaging with the fact of like the whiteness and like cis-heteronormativity. There we go. All sex. And I want to know, like, in your thesis, did you like kind of talk about in the ways in which like choosing facilitators may kind of lead into that structure? Like, cause just cause like it seems like in terms of just like the way in which people end up joining all sex is because they may have done it before or they're friends with facilitators, but this sometimes leads to this like feedback loop of this continued like whiteness and things like that. And so, which obviously leads into all these different structures again. So I just wanted to know if you like talked about that or thought about that in your thesis.
So I essentially, because the kind of interview process ended up being a real learning process for me, I really only ended up addressing the kind of like replication of the facilitator structure within my like last couple of interviews. But it is interesting the way that people are obviously have a lot of kind of like personal like pride, but also care for their community, and like so are not so willing to see the kind of like deconstruction of the kind of replication that you're talking about within the, but you know, hope for the future.
Final quick question.
I have a follow-up question on that. Since your thesis is asking the question of like, can you break free of a neoliberal model within a neoliberal institution? I'm wondering if in your interviews there was a difference between past facilitators and current facilitators, of people who are like out of the Columbia space and their perspective on the research that you were doing.
Yeah, and then maybe both of you, yes or no question, can you break free of neoliberal model?
I mean, you know, but there was a difference between the people who I interviewed who were, like a lot of the kind of recommendations that I spoke to at the end came from a perspective outside, like for people who had graduated. But also, I feel like it's crucial to talk about the way in which that, like, all sex actually helped some of my interviewees learn about those very processes and perhaps like go on their way towards having that kind of perspective even within the kind of university structure.
Oh, was your question a joke or? I mean, I think that independent forms of media, like zines or like self-run blogs, are a way to kind of challenge these neoliberal structures and structures of capitalism that view particularly young people, and with the, I guess, like co-optation of feminist and anti-racist politics, like marginalize young people, there's a way for them to create and envision possibilities outside of that through zines and blogs.
Okay, so our final panel on global sexual politics. And I would like to introduce our first speaker, Eva Marie Couch, who's going to be speaking about forced sterilization in Peru. And I'm going to try and get us a little bit more light.
Hi everyone, my name is Eve Marie and my thesis is Forced Sterilization in Peru, Justice and Memory Work in the Wake of Armed Conflict. So to begin with, I offer a brief historical background to give context for my presentation. In the 1980s and 1990s, Peru experienced 2 decades of violence due to their internal conflict, which was a 3-way war between the Peruvian government, Sendero Luminoso, or the Shining Path, which was Peru's Maoist Communist Party, and the Tupac Amaru Revolutionary Movement, which was another communist insurgent group. These 3 parties committed grand acts of violence during these 2 decades, most of which was felt and directed at the poor indigenous communities of the rural Andes. President Alberto Fujimori, pictured here, was elected to the presidency in 1990 and had a large hand in dismantling the communist groups by capturing both their leaders in 1992. The same year, he also staged a coup of the government and made the government much more authoritarian and gave him a lot more power.
After a corruption scandal in 2000, he fled the country and resigned the presidency, but was later imprisoned for crimes against humanity related to the armed conflict. In 1995, however, before he resigned, Fujimori announced his family planning program that would go into effect the next year in 1996, the National Population Program. His stated goal was to lower the poverty rate of Peru by lowering the fertility rate to 2.5 children per woman. And because the fertility rate was higher in the rural areas of Peru than in the urban cities, many of the mobile clinics deployed in the sterilization program were sent to the rural Andes. This meant that the people most affected by the sterilizations campaign were the poor indigenous communities of the rural Andes, the same population that was most affected by the violence of the armed conflict. These sterilizations were often non-consensual, coerced, or otherwise somehow manipulated. If a consent form was signed, it may have been dated incorrectly, often for days after the procedure had actually occurred. Or another instance that would happen is the person signing it may have only spoken Quechua, which is the native language of the Andes, and they would not have understood the Spanish that the form they were signing was in. Additionally, patients were often not informed of other birth control methods and made to believe that sterilization was the only option. Another important aspect to talk about of this family planning campaign is the clear classism and racism that many women faced throughout it. Many were told by doctors or nurses that they had too many children and that because they were poor, they needed to have this operation in order to have fewer children. This sentiment of poor racialized subjects as having large families that they cannot sustain is evident in this political cartoon or propaganda piece for the sterilization campaign that reads, "Family planning, you could have avoided this moment." In it depicts the family and the mom is thinking, "My God, another one." Over on the side it says, "You decide how many children to have. Family planning helps us live better and happier." And down at the bottom, "So that this doesn't happen to you, visit the health center. You will receive free information and attention." In this image, you can clearly see the class aspect of the sterilization campaign as it plays on stereotypes of poor families as those that have many children and therefore need to be sterilized in order to have smaller families with less of a financial burden. And in Peru, the poorest parts of the country are the Andes, while the coastal cities are wealthier. This also corresponds with race. The indigenous communities are for the most part located in the Andes, while the white Peruvians of Spanish descent reside in the cities. As I noted earlier, the family planning program deployed clinics in the rural Andes due to the fact that the fertility rate was higher than in wealthy urban centers. This meant that the people most affected were primarily indigenous women. With all this in mind, my main questions for this project were, how does the Peruvian state understand the sterilizations as connected or not connected to the armed conflict? How do women's rights and activist organizations understand the sterilization campaign and what are they doing about it? What impact do official recognitions of violence and reparations have on a post-conflict nation? And in truth commissions, who gets to speak and whose voice is ignored? So in the early 2000s, the Peruvian government instigated a Truth and Reconciliation Commission established in 2001 to examine the human rights abuses and the violence that occurred between 1980 and 2000, which is the years of the armed conflict that I mentioned earlier. The final report was issued in 2003 and covered a wide scope of topics as the mandate for the Truth Commission was purposely left open to interpretation. However, there is no mention of the sterilizations in the final report, despite the fact that they happened within the range of time that the Truth Commission covered. While the Commission was encouraged to use the Rome Statute's definition of sexual violence, which includes forced sterilization, they did not consider the sterilizations as connected to the armed conflict. They do, however, mention other forms of sexual violence, namely the rape of women during the conflict by police and other government forces. This demonstrates that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was not above holding the state accountable for sexual violence, so the omission of the sterilizations demonstrates that they did not see them as connected to the armed conflict. This omission denies the survivors of the sterilization campaign justice and reconciliation. One of my main sources for this project is the Kipu Project, which is an online audio archive of testimonies from the women and men who were affected by the sterilization campaign. They organized their website in the form of a kipu, pictured here on the side, which is an ancient Andean practice that was used to keep records and tell stories across generations. In invoking this imagery, the Kipu Project centers their project as one that prioritizes the voices of the indigenous communities that were affected by the sterilizations. On this interactive interface, the KIPU project categorizes the testimonies they have in 4 categories. 1, the sterilization program, the operations, the life after, and finally looking for justice. These 4 categories make up the knots of the Andean KIPU. Some threads or testimonies have 1 knot or category, while others have 3 or even all 4. This clear organization of the testimonies allows you to hear directly from the survivors what they experienced and what kinds of justice and reparations they want. Many of the women in their testimonies ask specifically for medical treatment from the government. For example, in testimony 99 out of 135, the woman says, "They forced me to get sterilized at the hospital when I went to give birth without my husband's consent. They even faked my husband's ID number. Now we find ourselves ill, with back pain, ovary pain, infections, everything. We have no support at all. We want justice. We have been suffering for so many years. There's not even a doctor to check our health, nothing. I want justice to be done for us." This statement is echoed by many other testimonies which call for medical attention, their reasoning being that the government brought mobile clinics in to the Andes to do this to them, so that they should provide similar medical services to help them heal. In their calls for justice, these women point out how the government has not supported them at all, nor recognized their experiences through the Truth Commission or a judicial verdict condemning Fujimori. However, many scholars note that truth and reconciliation projects do not actually change societal structures of racism and sexism and classism. In particular, Colleen Duggan et al. State, "In our view, public apology and the delivery of reparations to survivors of sexual and reproductive violence are of limited use if they ignore the structural dimension." So these authors raise really important questions about what the definition of justice is and how memory work, which I define as the listening and sharing of stories, how that fits into justice. They argue that memory work is not enough to bring justice for survivors of sexual and reproductive violence. And Laura Stoller also discusses memory work, specifically in relation to colonialism. She holds that memory work, even when it is intended to center colonized voices, can sometimes obscure the experiences of those most marginalized in a society if the memory work focuses on a single event. So I argue that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in focusing on the armed conflict as an event, eclipsed the experiences of the indigenous women who were forcibly sterilized. The KIPU project, in providing a framework of allowing survivors to share their stories beyond what happened with the sterilizations, giving them the opportunity to talk about how it's impacted their life after, to this day, 20 years later, this creates an opportunity to better center voices that have been silenced through years of colonial control. So my conclusions for this thesis are as follows. First, that the forced sterilizations that occurred under Fujimori's presidency are indeed connected to the armed conflict due to the fact that it was the same population that was affected in both events. However, the Peruvian government does not see them as related. As of today, there have not been any official actions to bring justice to the victims of sterilizations. There has not been any criminal complaint filed against Fujimori or his ministers of health. In fact, on December 24th of last year, 2017, Fujimori was pardoned of his crimes against humanity by President Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, and this sparked protests in Peru that are still going on to this day. And while the crimes against humanity that he was in prison for did not include the sterilizations, this has become a rallying point for many feminist organizations to call for justice and getting the women and men who experience this some form of recognition. In addition to this, Fujimori's family and his political party still holds a lot of power in Peru and in their government and their Congress. I argue that the KIPU project is like an independent truth commission in that it offers a space for survivors to share their stories and participate in memory work. However, it does not do the same thing as government recognition, and as is made clear in the project's testimonies, many women call for this government recognition and reparations, specifically in the form of medical attention. Through the KIPU project, survivors of the sterilization program can engage in the memory work that they were denied by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. As many of the testimonies note, as well as this protest banner, which says, "A nation without memory has no future," memory and storytelling are extremely important to Peruvians in how they understand the violence of the 1980s and 1990s. Additionally, as I mentioned earlier, a question that many scholars raise is what impact official recognition has on larger societal structures. Institutional recognition and truth commissions cannot be expected to fix larger societal structures such as racism, classism, and sexism that are the aftermath of Spanish colonialism in Peru. This is made evident by the fact that despite the Truth Commission and the imprisonment of Fujimori, he has now been pardoned and the politics that he represents in Peru are still a strong force. While the Kipu Project cannot undo these lasting impacts of colonialism, through focusing not on an event but the experiences of these indigenous women, they take small steps to center historically marginalized bodies and voices. I want to close on this quote from Julia Tamayo, who is a Peruvian human rights activist, and she says, "Very arrogantly, they thought that being indigenous women, illiterate, the weakest of the weak, they wouldn't dare to speak. Well, they were wrong. They spoke." Thank you. Presenter is Talay Kamran.
Hi everyone, my name is Talay and the title of my thesis is Out of Iran and Out of the Closet, Home, Homo-Nationalism, and the Development of LGBT Advocacy in the Los Angeles Iranian Jewish Community. So this is a pretty niche community if you didn't grow up in it like me, so for a little bit of historical background. In the early 1980s, Los Angeles received an influx of Iranians leaving Iran following the 1979 revolution. Approximately 30,000 Iranian Jews settled in Los Angeles County. Now 40 years old, the community has both thrived as well as continued to encounter the challenges of not only attempting to assimilate into a larger, mostly white Ashkenazi Jewish community, but also a post-9/11 US socio-political landscape. Iranian Jews, as can be seen in this article just entitled "The Persian Conquest," are often criticized for being insular, being too involved in their children and community members' lives, and in general for presenting a boisterous, disruptive, and ethnic other into a largely homogeneous community. One site where this tension plays out is in looking at how the Iranian Jewish community's attitudes on homosexuality have been criticized and have changed through their struggle with assimilation, US anti-Iranian sentiment, and Ashkenazi superiority and normativity in Los Angeles. As this rabbi points out in an op-ed she wrote, she attributes the homophobia of the community to the fact that first-generation Persian Jews, immigrants who were raised in the Muslim culture of Iran, have very strong prejudices against gays and lesbians, while American Persian Jews raised in the US and generally college-educated have very different opinions. So the writer is explicitly characterizing what's happening as a culture clash, but this kind of rhetoric and narrative of ethnic tension ignores how LGBT subjectivity and rights fits into the broader narrative of American exceptionalism and liberalism, which puts increased pressure on the Iranian Jewish community in Los Angeles to accept homosexuality. Thus, in this paper, I seek to use my experience growing up within the community to analyze how we have responded to growing support for LGBT rights on a national scale. My main avenue for observing and describing the Iranian Jewish assimilation and new efforts to advocate for LGBT rights in the US is by examining the organization We Do Care. We Do Care was started 3 years ago by 2 Iranian Jewish mothers who are grappling with how to accept their LGBT children and maintain their status within the larger homophobic Iranian Jewish community. The group has evolved over the past few years from a support group facilitated by an Iranian Jewish psychologist into an advocacy and education group. With the development of specifically Iranian Jewish LGBT spaces, I ask, what forms of sexuality and gender identity are produced within the diaspora? How does acceptance of LGBT rights affect community attempts to assimilate into larger American society? Who is made unintelligible with the introduction of American-specific expressions of queerness? And what is the role of US politics, both foreign and domestic, and the war on terror on this relatively new movement within the community? So to understand this, we need to have both an understanding of US and Western influence on Iranian sexual politics pre-immigration, as well as an understanding of current tensions between Iran and the US that temper Iranian-American attitudes on homosexuality.
Homophobic attitudes in Iranian communities are the result of a mix of imperial and economic influences from America, as well as a concerted effort by the Iranian government to spread Western social values during the Pahlavi monarchy. The period of 63 through 78, termed the White Revolution, under Mohammad Reza Shah, was an attempt by the new king to create a clear Westernization curriculum for the country, including instructional texts for medical professionals and the first explicitly anti-gay legislation within the nation's history. Now, as scholar Jasbir Puar points out when she coined the term homonationalism, an exceptional form of national heteronormativity is now joined by an exceptional form of national homonormativity. In other words, homonationalism. And the United States continues to exert power over Iran through discursive and narrative manipulation, which paints the US as the paradigmatic regime for homosexual acceptance and safety. In contrast, modern-day Iran is painted as exceptional in its cruel treatment of homosexuals, as well as is painted as deeply barbaric and backward in its understanding of sexuality at large. American criticism and intervention in Iranian gay rights matters are used not only to bolster US power against the threat of the Iranian government, but also to control the subjectivities and narratives of LGBT Iranians within America. So I wanted to see whether and to what extent homonationalism has affected the formation of queernesses in the Iranian diaspora, as well as what the larger Iranian American community's perspective now is on what does and doesn't constitute acceptable forms of queerness. So I conducted 7 unstructured interviews, 3 with parents in We Do Care, 2 with second-generation LGBT organizers, and 2 with second-generation LGBT members of the community who don't organize around this topic. In addition to that, obviously growing up as a queer person in this community, this is the product of my own thoughts and ruminations over a really long period of time, so it's partially autoethnographic as well. So the first person that I interviewed was the founder of We Do Care, who explained to me that I never thought I wanted to be an advocate, to do something where people are coming. I wanted to be part of something that gets the family together, to talk about it, be comfortable, and to start new families with our own kids. And I achieved that because, every Friday night in a month, we get together with our kids, and that's what I want, and I achieved that. So Roya's hope was to connect her queer child to the Persian community and create space for herself as well. This was motivated by wanting to make an effort to show her child that she wanted to understand and celebrate their identity, but also wanting to contextualize their queerness within Iranian Jewish space. So after the development of We Do Care, other organizations began to crop up or take notice of We Do Care and create Iranian wings of their programming, like JQ International. As the topic of the panel that JQ has put on here points out, these organizations often frame themselves as safe houses for brown queers and construct this narrative with the help of community members who, using the theory of Joseph Massad regarding the Gay International, I term diasporic informants. Diasporic informants corroborate claims of the inherent backwardsness of the culture of the Iranian diaspora and serve as people who really know how to fix the problem, essentially. So one such informant explains or attributes the homophobia of the community to the fact that we go back to this very communal, tribal existence, but that now we're moving into individual lives where people are allowed to be themselves. And anyone can get on the internet and connect with anybody, and most importantly, my parents can't set the standard anymore about who I am. It's about knowing who I am. So the focus on coming out as the necessary and central tactic for LGBT inclusion further reflects the identity-based focus of the individual identity-based focus of the larger US gay rights movement. And as scholar Marlon B. Ross points out, fixes homosexual identification to a narrative of progress, not only in terms of individual sexuality, but also more fundamentally as a doorway marking the threshold between up-to-date fashions of sexuality and all the outmoded anachronistic others. This narrative of progress carries the residue, and occasionally, the outright intention born within evolutionary notions of the uneven development of the races from primitive darkness to civilized enlightenment. Moreover, such remarks on the collectivist versus individualist society assume that queerness can only exist within a societal structure that is premised on individuality, singular living, detachment from elders, which undermines the queer experience of many Iranians for whom family and communal decision-making remain important. It also forecloses the possibility of queer expression that does not fit within the white, predominantly cisgender, hormonormative US gay landscape. The effect of this normative narrative is not just felt in these newer spaces, but also in the ways that rhetoric among We Do Care parents has changed. So in an interview with one mother, for example, I asked about how her perspective on LGBT people has changed since joining We Do Care, and she explained that nowadays, if you see them on the street, you don't even know who's gay and who's straight. But at those times, they actually wanted to show it to you that they were different. Now they don't have to shave their heads or put on makeup or women's clothes. They can be normal. Go into a doctor's office. The best doctor you know can be a lesbian. So the politics of inclusion and normativity that are championed by these outside organizations advance a "we're just like you" argument that locates the homosexual or queer subject both as American and as entirely apolitical with normal professions and life paths. And while some forms of queerness are normalized, this can only happen by marginalizing other experiences and representations of sexual and gender variance. In light of all this, I was prepared to find a simple narrative of assimilation, homo-nationalism, and denial of homeland embedded in the Iranian Jewish community's recent embrace of queerness. But I found that even amongst diasporic informants, alongside the mix of homo-nationalist discourse is an organic movement within the community to carve out space for non-normative and distinctly Iranian Jewish sexualities. So, drawing on the work of diaspora studies and queer studies, what I found is that much of Iranian Jewish diasporic life disrupts the coherence of the American nation state through rejecting its model of individuality that undergirds various identity formations, including LGBT ones. Scholars of diaspora studies see diaspora as inherently a place of disorientation, dislocation, and unsettling. What queer diaspora scholars ask, though, is what analytical possibilities open up when we consider the relation between sexuality, identity, and desire on the one hand, and geographic mobility, estrangement, and displacement on the other. In sifting through the history of the relationship between Iranian Jewry, the state, and the West, reveals that multiple forces animate the sexual politics and social organization of the Iranian Jewish diaspora, as well as how it has begun to change. So I propose that the lens of queer diaspora serves two productive or generative functions for the community in that it destabilizes normative, implicitly white iterations of queerness, and it also forces individuals and institutions to grapple with the histories of imperialism, displacement, and cultural erasure that the community has faced. This challenges homo-nationalist organizations that operate under a West and the rest paradigm, which sees Western conceptions of homosexuality as an outgrowth of an overall superior social and national culture. So perhaps the collectivist kinship practices of the Iranian Jewish community, often prescribed as a barrier to LGBT liberation, could be reframed or read as queer in and of themselves, in that Iranian Jewish kinship represents a set of distant practices that dislocate white Western sexuality and sociality. The sentiments of parents in We Do Care, which are hyper-focused on getting their queer and seemingly Americanized children to engage with the larger diaspora, is a reflection of this. This brings me to discuss one of the sites where I see queer diaspora developing, which is the home, and particularly the home as a gathering and ritual space. All of my informants identified the home as a significant space for personal identity formation and for the preservation and perpetuation of certain aspects of Iranian Jewish cultural and kinship practices. One second-generation informant explained, "I never really came out to my family. I just kept showing up. Someone died, I showed up. Someone got married, I showed up. Someone had a baby, I showed up. But people who go down the wrong path stop showing up, so I kept showing up. In my docs, in my button-ups, and finally in a suit one year on T. Traditionally, I think someone like me would just start to disappear. I think my family realized that too. So their response was to keep embracing me and inviting me, and my response was to keep keep showing up. So this shows how the boundaries of the Iranian Jewish diasporic home are relatively elastic and allow for stretching and space making even in the most tense situations. The home as a gathering space in particular is the site of queer possibility and intervention because as queer bodies enter the space, they assert the existence of queer Iranian Jewishness in a different way than the existence of than homo-national spaces that tout multiculturalism and locate queer liberation outside of Iran and Iranian culture. As South Asian queer diaspora scholar Gayatri Gopinath points out, while many lesbian and gay texts imagine home as a place to be left behind, for queer racialized immigrant subjects, staying put becomes a way of remaining within the oppressive structures of the home, while imaginatively working to dislodge its heteronormative logic. So out of this, what I see happening is that the amalgamation of accumulated cultural memory, ritual and tradition, and the unavoidable choice between hybridity or erasure facing the community has created a climate of queer diasporic possibility. Working within a queer diasporic framework that locates queerness within the diaspora affirms the existence of non-normative queer identities and rejects the idea that Iranianness and queerness are diametrically opposed.
Our final speaker on this panel and for today will be Craig Willard Nielsen. Normativity.
Thanks for sticking around. It's pretty late. And also thanks to all my colleagues for an incredible set of presentations. Also thank you, my advisor, Alex Pittman, for incredible, generous feedback on all of my drafts so far. So, okay, so I'm just going to be reading sections of my thesis, I guess. So, in the past decade, the United States government's use of armed combat drones in counter-terrorist operations overseas has risen astronomically, including in countries with which the U.S. is not formally at war. In the wake of 9/11, the stateless and deterritorialized threat raised by the specter, quote, Islamic terrorism, has led the U.S. to project its military power in a similarly deterritorialized fashion, choosing to go wherever the enemy goes, that is to say, potentially everywhere. As both an exception to the normative rules of warfare and exceptional in its technological capabilities, drone warfare is a key method through which the U.S. recodes its transgression of sovereign borders as technologies of peacekeeping within the homeland. Critical scholarship on drones is focused predominantly on the visuality of drone surveillance, the racialized target construction of drone strikes, and the hybrid/cyborg embodiments central to their operationalization. Significantly less attention has been granted to the materiality of drone violence in terms of its reconstitution of norms of gender and sexuality within the imperialist war on terror. Further, it is yet to be articulated how the increased usage of drones in U.S. theaters of war is connected, if at all, to the recent mainstreaming of queer politics in the U.S. and those politics' corresponding containment within discourses of militarism, privatization, and criminalization. What, then, does a queer epistemology bring to bear upon a critical analysis of drone warfare? How can a queer studies perspective elaborate upon this crucial dimension of U.S. global security, albeit one that remains radically underspecified within the queer scholarship? By mobilizing a queer studies critique of homo-nationalism, that word's not going away, in the context of the war on terror, my thesis resituates the U.S. drone program's targeting and surveillance of racialized populations within a queer necropolitics of preemptive and anticipatory governance. It does so by reading the exceptionalism of U.S. drone violence alongside an emergent sexual exceptionalism, whereby certain queer subjects are folded into the social life of the nation through their tacit acceptance of permanent war elsewhere, now waged increasingly by drones. Notably, the ongoing massacre of Arab, South Asian, and North African civilians through drone warfare has unfolded alongside a period of unprecedented domestic gains for certain non-heterosexual people in the US. Such victories include Obama's repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the Supreme Court striking down the Defense of Marriage Act and its nationwide legalization of same-sex marriage, and the passage of state-level hate crime legislation that locates homophobic violence as a heightened identity-based offense. In my thesis, I argue that gender and sexual non-normativity has not merely been leveraged by the US state to normalize an imperial agenda, but in certain instances actually infuses and reconfigures US technologies of imperial violence. Consequently, my thesis is guided by 3 interrelated research questions. First, how might a queer studies perspective illuminate the proliferation of drone warfare as an imperial technology of rule? Second, what new forms of normativity, racial, gendered, sexual, national, imperial, are being configured through the ascendancy of US drone violence? And third, how might a queer theoretical lens be productively wielded to destabilize these emergent drone imaginaries? So, the second section is titled Drone Biopolitics, Queer Necropolitics. As numerous scholars have shown through robust accounts of the US drone apparatus, the covert drone program does not merely reduce war to a video game, but rather creates new forms of intimacy that reproduce the subject positions of the drone as hunter and its evasive prey. However, drone warfare's reshaping of security practices around an asymmetric, violent intimacy must be attended to in its sexualized dimensions. In turn, my thesis offers a queer rereading of the remote intimacy generated by US drone violence. It does so by understanding this intimacy as principally a sexualized relation, part of the imperial state's biopolitical investment in gender and sexual non-normativity, what Jasbir K. Puar and other queer scholars have described at length as homo-nationalism. I borrow heavily from Puar's critique of the queer drive for legibility through adherence to nationalist and patriotic norms, in order to illuminate the unfortunate complicity between queer claims for recognition and support for US shadow wars, including military violence waged by drones. In her book Terrorist Assemblages, Puar emphasizes the centrality of the perverse figure of the, quote, terrorist within contemporary Euro-American queer subject formation, and I quote Puar, "The queer terrorist regenerates a civilizational missive central to the reproduction of the racist heterosexist US and homonormative nationalisms." End quote. Standing opposed to the sexuality of the terrorist, imbued with notions of failed masculinity and repressed homosexuality, are the sexualities of American hetero and homonormative subjects, which index a muscular and virile nationalism, the sexual corollary to US imperial might. Puar's tethering of sexuality to biopolitics is especially important for my analysis, which understands practices of warfare and security as constituted through norms of racialized sexuality. Although its focus is ostensibly on the elimination of individual terror suspects, drone warfare enacts biopolitical forms of power at the level of populations. Under a system of biopolitics, upholding the biological fitness of a population constitutes the regulatory principle of governance. However, this optimization of life is contingent upon the confinement, destruction, and over-policing of subjects deemed excessive or perverse. Biopolitics thus turns principally around the question of proper sexuality, as the hinge connecting the disciplining of individual subjects and the large-scale management of populations. Fostering life necessitates the state's cultivation of a sexually exceptional population through norms of racialized sexuality, the regulation of which motivates the state to let certain subjects die or wear out in order to improve the lives of others. The supposed precision of drone warfare, including its objectification of targets of varying value, allows it to disclose itself as a biopolitics tasked with regulating uncertainty. In this way, drone violence emerges as not merely normalized, but normative, as producing what Caroline Holmquist describes as specific norms of the human. However, in practice, drone warfare orchestrates a necropolitics of the massacre, a far messier and disorganized exposure of bodies to violence. To illustrate this, I draw upon Achille Mbembe's concept of necropower, which extends theories of biopower to account for the resurgence of the sovereign right to kill within post-colonial contexts, including the target nations of the US-led war on terror. Theories of necropolitics indicate how, under a system of global biopolitical governance, it is not merely aberrant subjects who are deemed expendable, but rather entire populations who are exposed to the state's brutal program of letting die. Following the work of Jen Herdorn, Adi Kunstman, and Sylvia Pisoko, a specifically queer necropolitics reframes these racializing forms of violence as life-enhancing technologies of security for certain privileged sexual minoritarian subjects. Queer necropolitics, then, is a process of disaggregating exceptional white queer subjects whose livelihoods stand to be reserved from racialized queer populations categorically excluded from the zones of the living. Indeed, just as the war on terror allegedly constitutes a set of unprecedented circumstances demanding exceptional responses, the biopolitical security state is beginning to acknowledge certain formerly marginalized subjects whose social difference is required to paint U.S. war-making as a diverse and democratic initiative. Part 3, queering imminent threat. So, how do the biopolitics of homonationalism collude with the necropolitics of drone warfare to produce an imperial normativity premised on the queering of racialized others? To answer this, my thesis introduces the concept, and this is my title, of drononormativity, which, if you didn't know, is a play on homonormativity. So, as an analytic, drononormativity surveys the continuities between the emergent homonormative subject of US imperialism and the simultaneous queering of so-called imminent threats to US global security. In an effort to recontextualize drone violence within the shifting gender and sexual regimes of the war on terror, I use drononormativity to name the imperial state's normalization of remote forms of killing, alongside its intimate investment in certain forms of gender and sexual non-normativity, also known as homonationalism. Ultimately, I intend drononormativity as a way of conceptualizing the US drone apparatus's intimate policing of racial others, who are rendered queer insofar as their bodies constitute the raw material for imperial and homonationalist projects of securitization. The normalization of drone violence in the US is therefore also a normalization of its logic of killing. This logic is based not on discrete identities of terror suspects, but rather on profiles, indexical, of non-normative, quote, patterns of life, and that's the military term. Unlike personality strikes, in which the identity of the drone target is fully known, albeit located on one of the CIA's classified kill lists, signature strikes proceed via the cataloging of an anonymous suspect's pattern of life, primarily through the analysis of cell phone metadata. In this way, drone signature strikes do not merely eliminate suspected terrorist bodies, but they produce those bodies as packages of digital information whose possession of individual identities is thereafter thrown into crisis. Indeed, within the abstracting logics of drone warfare and the algorithms of its metadata program, targeted bodies are not considered human beings with names or identities, but merely potentially harmful patterns of life. In Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, Afghanistan, and Iraq, this process of risk coding has resulted in the deaths of innumerable civilians, the vast majority of whom bear no relation to nominally targeted organizations such as ISIS, Al-Qaeda, or the Taliban. In the movement from personality strikes to signature strikes, the function of drone violence shifts from militarized manhunt to the surveillance and disciplining of populations. The drone program's accumulation of behavioral data and its profiling of unknown individuals thus reformats the drone from a weapon of war into a technology of police power, tasked with patrolling the boundaries of normative modes of being human. In this way, drone violence constitutes a technology of necropower, insofar as it distinguishes between protected subjects belonging to a sovereign state from those open to perpetual surveillance and lethal violence within the non-sovereign borderlands. Through its destruction of perverse-seeming patterns of life, the drone apparatus rehearses as well as reconfigures historical patterns of racialization through queerness. Queerness here designates a racial killability that is biopolitically enacted through the preemptive governance of the counterterror state, and necropolitically secured through the lethal operations of the US drone apparatus. Forming the disavowed underside to the invitation of certain queers into empire, the drone apparatus produces its targets as monstrous pathological specimens, queer populations intended for biological cleansing. Here we see a special resonance with Puar's notion of the, quote, queer terrorists as the discursive and affective antithesis to upstanding homosexual patriots. Targeted subjects are firstly embodied as perverse, faceless patterns of life through the algorithms of the metadata program, and then swiftly disembodied by drones' exterminatory violence. Indeed, through its surveillance and pulverization of bodies based on anonymous yet suspect pattern of life signatures, the drone apparatus effectively queers its targets, algorithmic designations of perversity backed up by the incendiary force of Hellfire missiles. Whereas the algorithms of the US metadata program take hold of nameless suspects by representing them within the abstracting matrix of imminent threat, the obliterating force of drones' lethal payloads rids the embodied world of their pathological digital traces. In its quest for the complete destruction of non-normative patterns of life, the queer, unwanted others of US empire, the drone apparatus characteristically displays an overkilling zeal. And at this point in my thesis, I situate drone violence in conversation with Eric Stanley's work on queer overkill and the kind of post-mortem eradication of identifying features of queer bodies who have been murdered, but I won't go into that. But the intimacy, ferocity, and even enjoyment with which it eliminates bodies deemed pathological is what necropolitically configures the targets of drone violence as queer. Queered, in other words, by the protocols of drononormativity. The violence that secures this emergent drononormativity is both familiar in its reinscribing of colonial relations of rule and positively unique in its disaggregation of sanctioned imperial queerness from queer, non-human patterns of life. I have a final section, but I'll stop. 15 seconds? Okay. I'll just sure, yeah. I conclude with some possible future directions for queer scholarship on drones. Contrary to methodological approaches that locate the ontology of drone warfare and its materials and practices of prosecution, queer studies analysis engages the materiality of drone violence itself as it unfolds different bodies and produces new patterns of life and death in its wake. In pursuing this line of thought, critical scholarship on drones must go beyond simply articulating how the drone apparatus's mechanized reductions of space and identity rationalizes a particular form of disposability. It must also attend to how that experience of disposability is lived, mourned, and contested on the ground. In other words, the task is to theorize drone strikes beyond their operationalization. This demands an understanding of how drone logics do not merely construct targeted subjects as contaminating terrorist entities, but in fact usher new forms of being into existence as well. Thank you.
Night has almost fallen, so thank you everyone for staying around. Okay, our final panelists, questions.
So this question mainly for Eve. I was really interested in how you spoke about narration and whether memory was sufficient for achieving justice. And I wanted to know a little bit more about maybe what you think about different, in a landscape where that particular kind of forced sterilization relies so heavily on forensics, how can sort of the narration of the TRC, which relies on sort of narrating testimonies into something that's written and evidence-based, kind of compare to something that's more oral, especially given that casualty spoken information?
By forensics, do you mean like how their bodies have physically? I'm just a little bit confused by your use of forensics.
Like narrating by gathering evidence about the way that their bodies look.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question, and I hadn't thought that much about that aspect of it, but I think in looking at the Kipu project as an example, which was really very central to my thesis, and how they use interviews as a way to bring light to this happening, really, to me, like, that memory work was really important for that, and sort of gives an outlet to, like, their stated goal is to bring awareness to this. And in one of the interviews that I didn't mention, it was a man speaking, and he said he really wants people around the world to know what happened to them in Peru. So I think that memory work and interviews and storytelling can be really powerful, even when like there's this other aspect of proof, so to speak. Like I think that stories can be very powerful and impactful proof if you need proof or something like that.
Manager, Issy?
These were wonderful presentations. I have a question for Eve and a question for Talia. Eve, I wonder if you could say more about, beyond it being the same population that primarily experienced gun violence and the forced sterilization, what is the connection between the two? And did that come out in some of the testimonies? Did people feel like forced sterilization was a way of particularly demoralizing a population or decreasing a population that was backing that struggle? Was it a kind of military tactic in a way? I'm wondering what you think about it and how it came out in some of the testimonies. And Talia, I really enjoyed your presentation, very close to my heart as well. I want to talk to you more about it afterwards. But I wonder if you could say, I thought you did an excellent job talking about the kind of colonial history of homophobia in Iran, very similar to other colonial contexts, of course. I wonder if you could comment more about the specific experience of Jews under the Shah and after the revolution, and how that might, contribute to or manifest in what you are documenting here about a kind of desire to embrace the queer children of the diaspora.
To your first question, this was definitely something I thought about, and I think is more, I didn't really have time to go into it, but it's like a larger discussion of eugenics and genocide, and some of the sources I looked at talked about how the armed conflict in targeting the indigenous population was a form of genocide, and then in addition, the sterilization is a form of genocide, and so that I saw as a really clear link of control over these populations that have these colonized populations in Peru. And in terms of how it showed up in the Kipu project, and it's a very large database, so I listened to like a lot of it, but not all of it. So in the interviews that I listened to, no one directly mentioned the armed conflict, but to me there were threads of it throughout. In one interview, a woman said like, we have never been listened to, and so there was just kind of like an understanding of these communities as existing sort of like beyond the frame of government recognition of understanding.
Hi. So there's a whole section of my paper that's missing, specifically on how the Westernization project in Iran at the end of the Qajar era and very strongly in the Pahlavi monarchy included a specifically Iranian Jewish Westernization project. So at the same time that these things were happening, European Jewry started taking notice of Jewry in the Middle East as like the Zionist project in the 1800s was growing, and then in particular with the development of Alliance schools, which was a European Jewish like organization that would plant schools in different Middle Eastern countries. There was like an explicit shaming of Iranian Jewish. This was like really intense history to go through, but like people were kept from speaking Judeo-Persian, and there was one letter that I read from an Alliance director that actually said like these people like have carnal knowledge of each other at young ages and even like have practiced homosexuality, which is really interesting. But yes, there's a lot there.
This is kind of like combining Craig and Eve a little bit. So Craig spoke about how a queer kind of intervention in drone violence would go like beyond just articulating a phenomenology of drone violence, but more kind of the material conditions and new modes or patterns of life on the ground. And I'm wondering like if you could say more about kind of the material character of that, and also like combining Eve's notion of memory work, if such a thing could be kind of theorized through the lens of kind of reimagining the material, aftermath of drones.
Actually, one of the things that one of the lines of thought that I consider in my full thesis is actually the import of a queer disability studies analysis in the aftermath of drone violence, and how the turn to a kind of disability studies analysis kind of distends the temporality away from that of the strike to more of or the event, to that of a kind of structure of violence, of imperialism essentially. And so, as background, I guess, drone violence in the various countries that the United States occupies and illegally invades and surveils, they don't just produce scores of civilian casualties, they produce a host of disabled and debilitated populations, and the people who have a host of physical and psychiatric disabilities, from loss of limbs to loss of eyesight to deafness to post-traumatic stress disorder, and thinking about the narratives and the kind of affective afterlives that might emerge in the wake of US drone violence, I think is a way of troubling the kind of contemporary modes of counting and also not counting, speaking kind of more philosophically, that conventionally structure the way we speak about drones and their, and also, not to go further, that's kind of almost like a hip move in queer studies these days, is to be like, well, we can't talk about queerness without talking about crip or disabled bodies or crip or disabled sex. But I actually think that in this particular case, if you're thinking about peripheral modes of embodiment or non-normative patterns of life that kind of exist on the fringes of what we're talking about when it comes to violence, warfare, it really does, there is an extremely important resonance. Warfare is not just about killing the enemy, it's about debilitating infrastructure, debilitating populations. So, I don't know.
I'm going to echo what Sophie said and say I lost my train of thought. I think Craig said it all.
Okay, I think that is a sign that we should applaud our panelists. A final thank you to Mark and Matthew for organizing this morning.